Welcome to step 4 of my genealogical methodology series. This part, dealing with step 4 and some elements of step 5, regarding evidence analysis and correlation with some notes on evidence conflict resolution, which I argue tends to happen about the same time and should be kept in mind as we analyze and correlate our documents. So this presentation focuses on the intellectual heart of professional genealogical research, how to transfer raw information from sources into defensible conclusions about ancestral identities and relationships. I'm Andre Bagley, an accredited genealogist with Swedish specialization, and today we'll be exploring the methodologies that distinguish professional research from casual name collecting. So, why evidence matters? So let's start with the foundation. Evidence does not exist without research question. This is critical to understand because information sits in records all day long, but it only becomes evidence when one answers one's own research question. Remember, a birth date is just information until you need to prove somebody's identity, then it becomes evidence. The transformation flows. Sources give us information from which we identify evidence, from which we evaluate to potentially produce proof. Elizabeth Shawn Mills' process has a process map that clearly establishes this and illustrates this. And what separates a professional from a hobbyist? Well, we do this analysis and correlation in writing. We can explain why we reach our conclusions. A hobbyist might build a tree and say it looks right. We document the reasoning so that everyone can understand it. This Elizabeth Shawn Mills Foundation framework is something that every professional genealogist has to master. And it's best to think about this in a 3x3 grid. So first you have sources, which are containers, and we classify these as original records, derivative records, and authored works. Information is the content within those containers classified by the informant's relationship to the event, and from that we can determine such information is primary, secondary, or undeterminable if we can't figure out who the informant is. Source classification. Let's dig a little bit deeper into source classification. So original records are not based on prior records, aka they're not derivative, they're not dependent, they did not get created based off information copied from a prior record. They are the gold standard because as I have in my notes from a conference I took, 90% of the time, maybe even more, original records will have more information, more clues, more context for us to review than a derivative or an authored source. So a derivative record is a record that was created from a prior record that previously existed. So these are transcriptions, abstractions, translations, databases. Somebody made an index card file. They copied all the town records into it for your easy convenience, so you wouldn't have to look through the original. Or even if they made copies of it. Even the ones written by hand are derivative. So it doesn't have to be typed to be derivative. It can be handwritten too, if it's a copy. So anyways, the reason why we tend to worry about derivatives, they're somewhat viewed inferior, although sometimes you can't help if you only have a derivative source. Sometimes the original that they were copied from no longer exists, but if they do, you should always try to check it out because there might be important differences or some additional information. So, for example, and also the more times something gets copied, the more likely somebody is to make a mistake, and there's more chance for error to be introduced. Ever seen a bad online index on family search or ancestry? These are derivatives. Next is authored works. These are compiled information from multiple sources. These include things like family histories, compiled genealogies, obituaries, one-name studies. And you have to be very careful if there are no sources in an authored work, because you have to find documents to prove the information. And even if they do cite their sources, it'd be best practice for you to personally look them up and see the document for yourself. But a derivative source isn't bad per se, but you have to be mindful and account for the potential transcription errors, lost context, particularly if somebody copying older handwriting that might not be familiar with it. Handwriting changes over time. Somebody trying to copy something written 2 centuries prior, even in the 1800s, might not be able to read it well. It may make mistakes in how they interpret it. And then that can compound with other people trying to interpret their handwriting. That's why we like original manuscripts of things, particularly ancient texts. The older they are, that means the fewer copies, times they've been copied between the original existing, which we may no longer have, and the ones that maybe translations were based off of later. Anyways, that's just an example of it in academia. So information classification. So now we classify the content, and that depends on our source, and as I mentioned earlier, that depends entirely on your informant. It's primary if you know if somebody knew witnessed an event firsthand knowledge of the event, they were there, present. They could say, I was there, I recall seeing it, I know this for sure, an eyewitness. Then there's secondary information, secondhand, hearsay, tradition, family lore. Of course, there's some things to think about with secondary is how many steps in the chain are we between steps removed from the original eyewitness and the person you're finally hearing it from. That's something to think about, but it's kind of the evaluation stage at that point. But you have to think about things like a child reporting on a parent's birth. They weren't at the birth, obviously. They had to repeat what they're told, and honestly, though, fun fact, you have to be present. Remember this. None of us remember our birth. Somebody told us about our birth date, so even we are secondary sources about our own births, because you have to be present and conscious. Memory is really an important part here. So then there's indeterminable. Sometimes we have no idea who gave the source. There's a lot of newspaper articles where we just have no idea who told the reporter. Sometimes we don't even know who the reporter was. So how do you know? We don't know. So it's like an example in newspapers, older newspapers. Sometimes you don't even get the text is without any citation whatsoever of authorship. So that's really important to remember. So evidence classification. How we interpret how that information relates to our specific research question falls under 3 different categories. Direct, which answers the question directly, it can be right or wrong, but it answers your question head on. Example is a record that you're trying to find the birth parents of, or figure out who the parents of a certain person is. You find a record that specifically says that somebody is the father, lists their father as John Smith for this individual. Indirect is evidence requiring combining 2 or more pieces of information to suggest an answer. A land sale document combined with witness patterns, baptisms, and tax records might be used together to establish family relationships that no single family document states, or even simply you have two direct pieces of evidence that just don't directly connect to each other. For example, you have a record that says that Robert is the brother of Samuel, but you don't have any records of the first having a relationship to a parent. But however, Samuel has a record you identify that directly names his parents. So when you're answering the research question of who Robert's parents were, it's by way of saying Robert's parents were so and so and so and so because his brother, who we found to be because his brother was the child of that couple. So you have multiple pieces. You have two building blocks. A plus B equals C. Let's see if that makes any sense. Negative is where the evidence is contextually suggestive. Silence, the sound of the dog not barking. For those familiar with Sherlock Holmes, it's what's not there that tells you something. So, for example, if every single error is required to be mentioned in a particular document and your person's not mentioned, and your person's alive at the time, and you don't believe there's any evidence of fraud, you could probably conclude that likely your person you're looking for didn't belong to that family. Particularly in places like Sweden, where it was legally required and there was laws preventing you from omitting people. So something that you have to remember is that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. Negative evidence requires demonstrating that information should exist under the circumstances. Simply not finding something is just a negative finding, such as getting a nil, research in a database search, not negative evidence. You have to prove that you have to demonstrate that absence is significant. So the power of indirect evidence. So there's a counterintuitive principle that surprises many researchers. It's that direct evidence is not preferred over indirect evidence. Indirect evidence may actually be better than direct evidence in many cases. Why? Because indirect evidence is often derived from information without bias, which makes it less likely to be influenced by a single biased informant or a single informant with faulty memory. Sometimes there's not ill intent. Ill intent is less common than it is common in my experience. So you got to think about it. Say you find a family Bible and it says that somebody's the child of this particular couple, but you have to figure out who filled it out. What was their motives and agenda? Did they have an agenda? Did they have any reason to lie if the information wasn't true? Is there any possibility the information isn't true? There's a number of factors here to think about, information provenance and whatnot. But however, there's other pieces, like you can look at, say, that person's baptism witnesses for their children, and you notice siblings amongst those. And you find tax records, lands transactions that suggest sibling parent-child relationships. These records weren't created for genealogical bias or they have no reasonable reason to have genealogical bias in these types of documents. There was nothing stated that was directly about relationships. There's no reason to lie. They weren't created to prove lineage. When multiple unbiased sources converge on the same conclusion, particularly when you have direct evidence attached, it's really powerful. You have to remember also DNA is really useful here. It's really important. Matches by themselves match data by themselves doesn't prove anything, but it's when you correlate it that it does. provide evidence. So even with direct evidence, look for indirect evidence to get to the same point. It strengthens the conclusion by proving the validity of the direct evidence. Also, conversely, doing so allows you to find cases where the indirect evidence conflicts, and that has to be resolved. That's part of reasonably exhaustive research. So also while you were at it, we need to avoid the matchmaking fallacy, the name matches fallacy, such as saying, we have the same date names, the names match, the dates we're expecting, the dates match, the timeline that we believe for this family, and it's in the same place, or the place is what we'd expect. It seems reasonable. It must be true. You're assuming the databases and hinting systems are accurate. They're not. Seldom are they. Because you have to remember that there's often times where there's people that live in the same places, the same names, and it can easily trip you up if you're not careful. So what's correlation? So when you do analysis of a document, you examine individual sources in isolation. There's some things you should do with individual records, making sure that they're not inconsistent within the series of records that you find them in, or that they're out of place. That's definitely some red flags. But this is different documents found in different collections being correlated. So this is where you put them in a string with other documents and the reason why you do this is so you can identify patterns, find overlaps, where agreements and also conflicts. You think of analysis as examining each puzzle piece individually. You think about what color it is, what the image quality is, and how reliable the printing process was. Was it put together carelessly or sloppily? But correlation is fitting pieces together to see the big picture emerge. Sometimes other people have put together puzzle pieces and have put out their renderings of what they consider to be the big picture. They may be correct, they may not be, and it's really important to think for yourself and to critically correlate and make sure that those pieces really do fit together and that it's not just wishful thinking. Sometimes people will glue pieces together because they want them to fit, but they might not be real, or they might ignore conflicts because if they were to pay attention to them, it would also cause pieces not to fit neatly together, and they really want it to fit. That's why it's important to go into your research with the intent of looking for the truth and not just confirming your biases. So there's a couple different methods you can correlate evidence. There's narrative, timelines, tables, maps. Maps are really useful when it's heavy on land-based evidence. Where sometimes, particularly in early periods where land transfers between generations of families don't get recorded, sometimes all you have to go off of is looking at the land transaction, looking at the land boundaries and platting them, and seeing if there's overlaps if there's a piece of land that somebody has that came from a prior generation's larger piece of land, and you can infer relationships from there. There's tables, really useful for tracking people across similar record sets. And demonstrating similarities and conflicts. There's lists, good old-fashioned timelines, and then putting it all in, and then describing it in written form. Is there a right or wrong way to do it? Not necessarily. There's some ways where some forms are more effective in certain situations than others, so it's important to use them as it fits the situation. Some people argue that putting things like tables and maps add visual interest to reports and document and client deliverables, and so that makes it easier to follow, but that's kind of a secondary consideration in my opinion. It should be what's practical and what fits the situation, although keeping the client in mind is important for good customer service. source independence. So let's say that you have multiple sources created a number of years apart. I did a research project where there was 1911 census and a birth registration. They were 40 years apart, 44 years apart, but they were kept by different record keepers. They had different reasons for doing so. Neither were driven from the other, and that's what made the collaboration particularly meaningful. Oh, even though the census might not have said the precise birth date, the age listed, and when the census was given, the time of the year they would have asked for the age, there was ingredients, places listed, where's the ingredients, and collaborated with each other, it fit. So when two independent sources agree, you have genuine confirmation. And that's the start of a really nice, you're approaching genealogical proof. But here's the danger. Some people will insist on having three sources for every fact. Like, you have to have three sources or a certain number of sources. Well, the thing is, sometimes there isn't three sources for a particular fact. Sometimes there's only one. And also, not all sources are created equal. We have to consider the information independence. When somebody dies, and you notice they all have the same birth information. So, his obituary says the same thing about when he was born, when and where he was born. So does his death certificate. His tombstone has the same birth date as well. So, but the thing is, that's not really super significant because likely all those informants were the same. They were the loved one of the person that got the obituary published, who was the informant of the death certificate, who paid for and had the tombstone created and provided the information to have inscribed on the stone. They're probably the same person. They're not independent of each other. It's cool that you have them and you have multiple copies, but that's not as significant as having, a birth certificate or a baptism register that confirms that location. It was recorded independent in decades prior. So, anyways. So, eventually, if you haven't experienced it already, you're going to have conflicting evidence. You're going to experience having sources disagree with each other. So the genealogical proof standard requires you to resolve these in order to achieve proof. So there's three types of conflicts. Direct evidence items. One record says the parents are says one name set, and there's a completely different one for another. Sometimes maybe there's a common agreement with one parent, but there disagrees with another. Regardless, two direct evidence items conflict. Then there's direct evidence, where that swears that somebody's father's named this. All your indirect evidence suggests a completely different person was the father, and it's really strong when you view it from a totality standpoint. There's indirect evidence items that conflict with each other. Often this ends up being like stuff like identity, like a census record where the state varies. Ages don't progress as they should, as you'd expect it to. The calculated birth year is different. So, anyways, there's multiple standards in play. So, BCG standards 48, this is at least from their genealogical standards, first edition. They would say that first you have to identify every conflict, and second, logically determine why one side is entirely accurate and the other isn't. That's a critical principle that surprises some people, some researchers, that the quality of evidence for one side is not evaluated dismissing single disagreeing pieces of evidence. Like, there's an outlier, odd man out, therefore that fact's probably wrong. because there are cases where there's a case where large amounts of lower quality evidence, more sources that say one thing, but the single source on the other side is better, superior. So, like, you have 5 sources, like 5 different censuses saying they're born in 1850 in Ohio. But then you have an Ohio record, let's just say it's a baptism, because that's probably what exists back in 1848. Then that one's better if you can prove, particularly if you can prove that's definitely your person you're researching. That's definitive right there. It supersedes the other ones created later in life. It's recognized as superior for a laundry list of reasons. So anyways, standard 49, there's some acknowledged limits, and I've encountered these in the wild, where there's 2 sources of equal reliability disagree, and there's no other evidence that tips the scales. A conclusion that can be accepted as proof is impossible. And I've had situations where it's not possible to resolve. There's 2 possibilities, and I have examples I could come up with, but that would make this presentation too long. I've done versions of this where it goes for 2 hours. Nobody wants to watch a 2-hour presentation, so I'll try to be light on my examples. There's a case where I did have had patronymic surnames conflict, and I was able to come up with a theory of how they could be true, both be true, because I did that because I couldn't find additional evidence, put one over the other, but I still wanted to be able to explain it, and not just say that, because I couldn't tell you which one was wrong or which one was right. So I was doing what we call inductive reasoning, where you're trying to make a picture that fits the evidence you happen to have, but that's not defendable, it's not proof. Only deductive reasoning counts. All right? Because of evidence A, B, and C, it logically leads to this particular conclusion, versus a conclusion that conveniently fits your information, but involves elements that you can't prove directly with evidence. That makes sense? There's books written about this that explain it way better than I can. So this is a case of negative evidence that I've been able to come up with from my research. The case of an unreliable record keeper, where I used negative evidence to demonstrate that a particular person who I initially assumed might not have had origins in this parish that she got married and had children and died in. There's a backstory of why I thought that, but when I couldn't find there was no birth entry for her. So I figured she was probably not a native, and however, that was problematic, because eventually I researched her husband. I wanted to find out where he came from too, and I couldn't find a birth record, but I was able to follow pair in tax records, and I was able to identify him, and actually I was able to identify him with probate, taking him to a local family who I could prove was in the area. His brother had a brother that also didn't have records, but didn't have a birth record, but there were other siblings that did have parish records, and there's a gap, it seemed, that seemed hard to explain. And there's also digging further, noticed there was unusually low number of entries recorded of births at the time. So the register didn't have any obvious defects or damage, and the indexes I confirmed, were fundamentally complete and representative of all the entries that were in the register. So there was no obvious signs of neglect. So this was really confusing. So I was with me figuring out that Perry Johnson, Sarah's husband, his father was definitely living in the parish. I did tax records for every year, and they were definitely an official resident. There should have been a parish register entry. There was no alternative entries in any of the surrounding parishes, so it wasn't like they went somewhere. They went to another parish to get their kids baptized. So that led. So anyways, that's an example of negative evidence. And eventually, I was not to be really brief in writing or explaining. Eventually, I found using baptism witnesses of her children, identified a likely sister, and I was able to find the sister and her husband were cleared in multiple were witnesses / godparents of multiple of their children, and I found her that witness's family shared her surname, patronymic surname. Discovered there was this weird gap during the same time period that Perry Janssens didn't have his birth recorded. There's a 5-year gap in the parish registered births of this other candidate birth family. And anyways, I eventually found out that Hans Larsen was on the farm that Perry Janssen took over, and there was a maiden named Sarah that was there beforehand, and then that Sarah disappeared when Perry Janssen got married. So, and marriage records said that they were from that particular farm. So interesting, huh? And that particular farm was previously occupied by this widowed woman who I was able to demonstrate was an aunt of Hans, or maybe it was an aunt of Sarah. I don't remember the precise details of the report. If I went back, I could read it. But that's the thing, is that I had to use I had negative evidence proving that there was the absence was notable and had a particular meaning, and then I had used then I used indirect evidence to build a case and demonstrate that she was actually almost certainly a native of the parish, and just like her husband was, even though neither one of them had birth entries in the parish, and even though the parish records were appeared to be actively kept, I was able to demonstrate unreliability, and thus opening the possibility that they could have been born there. So 5 minutes of research that took many, many hours. All right. So there's cases where primary, original, or even original documents can deceive. Documents that you'd assume were correct that end up being where sometimes people try to lie or not tell the full truth because they have incentive to. I had a project I completed recently involving parafugal, and it was basically somebody had made in the household records. It was assumed that it was written that he was a native of the this Kevlinga parish, and however I was able to determine that he actually wasn't, because there was only like one possible candidate and I was able to use probate records to prove that family, their son pair didn't survive to adulthood, and that which was directly at odds with my guy, who was alive at the time of that probate and should have been mentioned had he been a part of the family. So I dug deeper, discovered that he actually had moved figured out the point where he moved in to the parish, found his moving certificate, and found it had some interesting materials. And one thing is that his birth information was like the ages that listed on his various records were very wild. Like it was hard to like what was on his death record, his household records, tax lists, like all these different sources were all just they suggested a whole range of dates. So I found his moving certificate because I was going to need to know where he came from to have a fair of a chance of finding be able to determine if I did find his correct birth entry in another parish. But there was these notes about how his age couldn't be determined. He did know the Lutheran Small Catechism, but he didn't know Bishop Sandel's Catechism explanations. And about his origins, where he came from before that point, when the certificate was being written or where he was moving in. Apparently, it alluded to some earlier certificates where basically it passed on the message that he couldn't decide or remember. He wasn't decisive about where he came from. So, however, you might think that was the end of the road, but here there was a very valuable clue where he didn't know Sandel's explanation. And for Swedish, I had me being experienced with Swedish research, I knew that Sandel's catechism explanation was standard text since the 1680s. And so basically, there's no way this guy could have possibly grown up in Sweden and not have learned this, because it was required. So I guess he was a soldier at the time, and it may have been disqualifying for him to have been a Dane or from another nation. It could have been from an enemy nation, perhaps. But evidently he had the linguistical ability to speak the language of Swedish. And I mean, it's plausible because, Danish and Skånish Swedish dialect, they're very, you can actually, I've been told you can still understand each other. It's like heavy, thick accents and occasionally some different vocabulary. It's like, talking to somebody from Scotland when you're from the United States. Sometimes they throw different lingo at you, and sometimes their accent makes them really hard to understand if you're not used to their dialect. But you wouldn't go, you're speaking, I don't understand what language you're speaking. So basically, it just seems like there was this creep where he lived in the place so long that everybody assumed he was a native, which is possible because early household records in the place for natives didn't write down where people were from, and somebody must have made that assumption for him, filled that in, and over time that got passed off as where he came from. So anyways, this is where multiple negative findings across independent record types helped me create a compelling evidence of likely foreign origins that had been deliberately obscured. Meanwhile, even the primary information, because remember, I'm referring to the moving certificate, information provided by coming from the person in question. This was an example of somebody making an assumption. It was a statement of he deliberately didn't give straight answers. And you can't accuse him of lying, but there's something funny. Can't quite put my finger on it, although there's this really weird thing that a native Swede should know, but he speaks the language, and we can't prove he's foreign. He doesn't say he's foreign. But yeah, anyways, that's a particularly interesting case. Strongly encourage them to use DNA to try to find what country of origin he may have come from. and try to push that brick wall further. Unfortunately, I haven't heard back from that client. So, but I'm hoping that I might be able to do more work on that one, because that'd be an interesting problem to solve. Figure out where this guy came from, because it's one of those cases where the guy deliberately covered his tracks as to where he came from. So there's 5 criteria for evaluating evidence, and this is really important. So and I learned this from Paul K. Graham. He's the last I checked, he was the official head trainer of the Ancestry Pro genealogist. So this guy knows what he's talking about. So you first got to think of why the record was created. Records created out of routine business, just government paperwork, is more likely to be accurate than one created for genealogical lineage documentation, where the people might want to fudge stuff to make things look pretty and not raise red flags. Purpose, reliability of the informant. Going back to reason of creation, a tax record has no genealogical agenda. Family history does. People want connections to exist. They want to be able to stretch back to the earliest known generation of people they can find. You want to if you have an immigrant ancestor or pilgrim, you want to be of the same surname. You want to be able to trace to that. You might be more willing to fudge things and get things to fit. See, then there's reliability of information. Consider how the informant obtained the information. Were they an eyewitness? Were they reporting just hearsay, what they heard? Did they have any reason to distort or fabricate the information they were providing, deceive, for the purpose of deception? Prior example, I had a guy where if he was an enemy to the state, he probably would not have been allowed in the army, the Swedish army, where he established his life in Sweden. He wanted to be viewed as a native, and so he played dumb about. It's like, I'm not sure where I came from. I'm not sure how old I am. I don't know what kind of story he told. We don't mention that. We just get the moving certificate providing the synopsis summary of those exchanges. Then you have chronological closeness. The closer something is by date, particularly recording, relationship and experience, is more likely to be accurate. So you might have somebody swear somebody's born on a certain date for a birth certificate. A delayed one produced like decades later, plus likely to be precisely accurate as one created just immediately after. There's many examples I could come up with from my research I've done over the years. So then openness to challenge. When information can be cross-examined, such as in a court, it's more likely to be what's recorded is more likely to be accurately provided. People are less likely to lie under oath versus what they write in a private letter. And protection against tampering. Historical provenance. If a record was presented in a court and it's been stored there, guarded but by their staff, it's less likely to be altered than something that's been in private hands. So less chances for somebody to take a pen and change the facts, adjust the marriage dates to make it so that it looks like they didn't have their first couple's child was born more than at least 9 months after their marriage. So if somebody accuses them of premarital relations, because some people were sensitive about that then. People are less sensitive of that now, although there's definitely exceptions. People were particularly sensitive about that back then. Did not want to be accused of being illegitimate. And people would present information with that view. So these criteria help determine which sources are likely to contain accurate information regardless of how many other sources say otherwise. So there's 3 forms of written proof. The genealogical proof standard requires written conclusions. You match your documentation to your evidence complexity. So you have single sentences with citation. Use what you have for direct evidence. You have no conflicts. You can just say a sentence. You cite it. You move on. Really good for compiled genealogies where you're trying to save space and you don't have and there's no problems. It's quick, honest, to the point. Proof summaries, you might want to make a list or a paragraph or two describing minor inconsistencies that agree on identity, but we may have some minor points where they disagree, variations that you can be easily reconcile. Simple, logical, fact-based explanations. There's proof argument where you have an extended narrative, thousands of words possibly required to use when you have significant conflicts, like things that fundamentally conflict, or there's a body of evidence that seems to scream one direction, but you have to argue that there's one that tells a completely different narrative, and that's the voice you need to pay attention to, and you have to really explain why that one source is superior to all other explanations, particularly the most popular explanation that seems to have the most numerical documentation in favor of it. So there's suggestions of how to structure it, particularly when you have multiple hypotheses or you have absence of direct evidence as well. So you write it, first section, strongest case. This is the most likely, this is a situation that scenario case that after doing all this research appears to be the best one. Second, you have to describe any conflicts, the case of the conflict, and then conclusions describing the weight of evidence where one such scenario that the documents can support overrule the other as to what you finally believe in and what should be ultimately believed in as being the truth. So it's important to not over-document or under-document. You need to match the form to the evidence situation's complexity. It's important to remember that individuals didn't live in vacuums. And also, they still don't live in vacuums. People live in societies with expectations. There's social pressures and norms, economic contexts. There's also politics too. There's always reasons why people lived the lives they did, and knowing about history helps you understand the whys that may have motivated actions of people. Also, it gives you important context on which to drive searches forward. So, some examples are knowing when places were settled. For example, somebody shows up, you find somebody on the 1860 census, but you can't find them before then living that place. But what if you happen to look up the place and find out that it was founded in 1854? If you know the person was born in 1820, you know that they must have come from somewhere else. They couldn't have been born there. They couldn't have been a native. They appear to have probably been a part of the founding population. And you can use clues, other documents, to determine when exactly they showed up, land records, etc., tax lists, and then from there, if you don't get clues from those records, you can use other clues such as county histories saying that most of the settlers who came to this particular area, founded the town, came from this place. So, and then there's things like occupations. So knowing what somebody did, let's say you might have a record of somebody being a miner, but you might not know if they were a particular type of miner. You might want to see if you find them frequenting or showing up at certain places, it might be important to look at what kind of mines were there. Usually people would work mines that were familiar to them, particularly if you were a specialty miner. There's cases that I've heard, I've had colleagues work on where they found somebody, were able to determine that there was this common named person and that they were the same individual because every place they showed up at was at these special mines. And they knew that because of the history, looking at the area that they lived in. And so when they disappeared, they would look for these special mines, and lo and behold, the individual they were looking for would tend to show up in the records nearby those mines. In communities that worked in and provided labor for those mines. Another thing is economic circumstances. Now, there's a number of ways of looking at this. One example I could think of is you'll find somebody's giving back portions of their land to resolve a tax lien, and then they disappear. Well, that might not be surprising because you learn about their financial situation. People in financial insecurity tend to be more likely to move to try to find a greener pasture. People doing well for themselves usually don't, although there are cases where people used to just go where the land was. They'd get land when it was cheap, work it long enough to establish it, wait for the land prices to rise up, and then sell it to the next person for a considerable profit, and rinse, wash, and repeat. You'll know if you have a person like that because usually they do that more than once. But you can figure out, and if you find that to be the case, then you can follow migration routes and see other people who are following the same patterns, backwards or forwards. And that's where the fan club's really important. So just something that to keep in mind. People don't just usually move places, particularly way back in the day, particularly long distances, just by themselves. I mean, we are often used to a more mobile idea of society where a family will just move cross country because they've heard of a job or they got hired by a company, and they'll move their whole family by themselves. But way back in the day, in the early frontier, you usually would only do so with people you knew. And particularly if you were settling a brand new place, you definitely would usually have a group of people you knew. And if your person, you're having a hard time finding records on your person, and you know that they settled somewhere, then you might want to look at the records of their associates and see if there's anything common with them. Because chances are your person probably has a connection with them back in time. From my experience reviewing ICAP Gen Level 1 study group applications, there's a very common deficiency I notice in reports. Reports are important at the end of the day because genealogical proof only exists in writing, and particularly professionals have to justify their time. It's another place where reports are valuable, is explaining how the time got used. And so anyways, I might see that there's evidence that there was evidence of analysis, that there was evidence analysis occurred, that there was some correlation, but the technical language and reasoning didn't get spelled out very well or at all, to the point where I want to assume I feel like it's safe to make that assumption, but I want to be sure that they know, particularly going into a professional level, certification pathway, that they know and are ready for that study group. I'll often make suggestions to insert some notes about primary versus secondary information, involving your informants, and talking about the reliability of of the information from different records and whatnot. Hopefully they do that in order to do conflict resolution. But sometimes they don't bring up everything, so you're not sure if there's conflicts or not. So I like to kind of think of it as a doctor-patient consult analogy. In my opinion, a good doctor will will use the formal terminology to describe, like, here's what we're doing. We're doing and an otomy or whatever, and then after using that, it's like what that is. We're going to go and do this and this and this, and then that's the simpler language that an average person typically understands and can follow. And what's great about that is that the patient can explain it in what's happening in plain words. But when you say that somebody's talking to another professional or they're talking to another person, they can use that term. The professional is exactly what we're talking about, and they don't. It's clear and defined what happened. So, but there's a balance. You can, like I mentioned before, you don't necessarily have to mention how it says, like, this document said this, and also that was said on here, here, and here. You could just simply say, if there's no conflict, you can say that across all documents this fact was consistent throughout. So you don't have to say, mention every single record or do a pull apart of each individual document in your report. You can just focus on the places where there's controversies or where there's particularly special information from a particular document that you might want to handle and discuss and treat. So you don't have to analyze every single element of every source if they're all in agreement. You can focus your detailed analysis in writing or any other system that you choose to present your evidence evaluation on conflicts, and then discussing the evidence that resolves those conflicts. So yeah, I'm going to do a much more in-depth article on report writing, or presentation on report writing. But another thing about writing is that I have this test, and this is something I think about. It's like, what if something were to happen to me? We never know when something's going to happen to us when our number's up. So, if you're elderly, you might pass away from natural causes. Even if you're young, you can pass away from natural causes unexpectedly. Death happens, and sometimes accidents happen. So I have the hit by a truck test. When you're trying to determine if you're documenting sufficiently. Basically, if you got hit by a truck and died, could somebody pick up after you what you were working on? I've often had to think about that because as a professional working in a company, because if something did happen to me, somebody would have to pick up and finish the project because there's a contract to the company, not to me, so it would still be active and there would be expectations for it to get done. Would I be doing them any favors? Would they be able to finish it easily, or would they be scratching their heads and going, I don't know what this guy was doing. I don't follow. Would they have to just start over and do the research from scratch because they couldn't follow your logic, couldn't follow what you were thinking about, or why you thought the documents you were identifying were related? I mean, understood that sometimes there's working theories that we might not be comfortable writing down immediately, but maybe you should be writing them down somewhere, maybe on a draft somewhere that can be accessed. That's why I think writing matters more than you would think. If it's not written down, it might as well have never happened, particularly after the fact. Sometimes research gets interrupted, shelved, mothballed, or sometimes once research is complete, we can forget about the specific details over time. Memory is finite. It fades. It gets fuzzy, gets confused, distorted, twisted. It's one of the unfortunate aspects of human memory is how fallible it is. If you ever have memory troubles, you definitely have a very acute understanding of what's like to have a brain that doesn't work the way you want it to, and retaining all the information and facts you wish it did. Brains are terrible places to store your research. If you're a genealogist that does a lot of research, works on a lot of trees, a lot of other people's trees, it's just a matter of time before you confuse or conflate a project. Even for the best people, after a month or two, it would be hard to tell you precise details about a project without looking at your notes, unless the project was particularly memorable, something that particularly stood out about it. There's a lot of very average, normal situations where it's like, okay, that was a really routine project, rinse, wash, repeat. There wasn't anything particularly special about that one. So, and for a really busy professional, sometimes that could just be a mere week or before you totally have to say, I gotta look at my notes because I don't remember very much about that project. Even during your project, sometimes if you're having to bounce back and forth between different lines because you're trying to figure out which side can be worked the most efficiently, you have to try and see which lines have the best prospects. Keeping all those facts straight can be daunting without proper documentation. Analysis and correlation should capture what one thought, what one understood about the problem, and why you thought each piece that you found and determined to be important enough to write down was important, and whether or not there was any particular context that made them particularly interesting and noteworthy that might not stand out to somebody that didn't have that particular knowledge or context. You need to put that in writing. Your future self's going to thank you. Anybody who inherits your work's going to thank you. Um, um, Other researchers will thank you. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me throughout this presentation. It's a little bit over an hour, so I understand it's easy to not watch something that long, and it can be hard to sit through an hour of somebody talking about a subject that's technical. So let me just go ahead and summarize some key principles. So classification always should precede evaluation of every source, information item, and evidence. Interpretation must be explicitly classified before it's weighed, because you can't evaluate what you haven't classified. Correlation reveals hidden patterns. There's what's written there, but correlation helps you identify patterns and confirms independence and exposes conflicts that a single source examination would miss. Quality supersedes quantity. You just remember that, just even one high quality piece of evidence can beat a mountain of garbage, because evaluations should be done on nature, not volume. A diamond's always going to be worth more than a pound of rocks. Just even it might seem like the rocks are heavier, but it's because there's more of them. That doesn't mean that it's better or higher grade. And that indirect evidence can be stronger. That because it can come from multiple sources that are unbiased or less likely to be biased, they may be more reliable than a single direct statement where that was given by somebody that would have bias or reasons to not disclose the truth or the whole truth. You shouldn't assume that direct's always better. Just ask DNA, where it's not direct evidence, but it's the gold standard once you can use it to demonstrate that two people have to be related through only a certain pathway of common descent based off of other matches and how they relate to each other, and the numbers of of shared genetic material, which they have, that's stronger than even a birth certificate. And because biology doesn't lie, there's only one way for genetics to get from one generation to the next. Here's some key authorities and resources. Most of what I'm quoting from is from past lectures I've attended and some key genealogical texts that are widely regarded. So if you're looking for getting an education on what to do as a professional genealogist, you want to read by yourself. Here's some books to read, and I strongly endorse Diana Elder and Nicole Dyers, their mother-daughter duo that run a company called Family Locket. Then they teach, besides writing those two books, they have an active course that runs. They have study groups that really are amazing and well worth your time and effort. You will learn from them, just like SLIG academies. There's also other places as well, but that's a subject for another time. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment, reach out to me. You reached out to me at my website, which I should put down in the description. And just remember that what really separates a pro from a beginner is that a hobbyist can put together a tree and say, I think this is right, but they might not be able to explain why. A professional is able to explain and articulate it adequately. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope that we'll be able to work together, and or you'll at the very least continue to subscribe and continue following my content to learn more about genealogy. Thank you, and bye-bye.